History doesn't always announce itself with gunshots or sirens. Sometimes history arrives quietly, riding in the back seat of a black Cadillac at 1:47 in the morning. July 7, 1968, Harlem. The streets were nearly empty, washed in yellow streetlight glow, the kind of quiet that only comes after midnight when the city exhales. Frank Lucas had driven these streets thousands of times. Same routes, same corners, same rhythm, 15 years behind the wheel for one man. Bumpy Johnson. To Harlem, Bumpy was more than a gangster. He was a symbol, a protector, a king without a crown. To Frank Lucas, he was something else entirely. He was family. That night, Frank was doing what he'd done 100 times before, driving Bumpy home after dinner at Wells' restaurant. Bumpy sat in the back seat, quiet, thoughtful, staring out the window like a man counting memories instead of streetlights. Then it happened. Frank. The voice was tight, strained, wrong. Frank glanced into the rearview mirror. Bumpy's face had gone pale, gray, sweat soaked through his collar. One hand clutched his chest like he was trying to keep his heart from tearing free. "Pull over," Bumpy said. Frank's pulse jumped. "Boss, you okay?" "I said pull over, now." Frank didn't argue. He yanked the Cadillac to the curb on 146th Street so hard the tires screeched. Bumpy shoved the door open and stumbled out, collapsing to his knees on the sidewalk like gravity had suddenly doubled. Frank was out of the car in seconds. "Bumpy, talk to me." Bumpy Johnson, who had stared down Italian mob bosses, survived decades in prison, ruled Harlem with an iron grip, looked up at Frank with fear in his eyes. Real fear. "Frank," Bumpy whispered, "get me home." Frank shook his head. "No, hospital's closed, we're going to the hospital." Bumpy grabbed his arm. The grip was weak, desperate, trembling. "No, I need to die at home, not out here, not like a dog." Those words froze Frank in place. Every instinct screamed hospital. 10 blocks, maybe less, minutes mattered, but Bumpy Johnson didn't beg, ever. And right now, he was begging. Frank swallowed hard. In 15 years, he had never said no to this man. "Okay, boss," Frank said quietly. "Okay, I got you." He lifted Bumpy, 220 pounds of legend, and laid him across the back seat. Then Frank drove like hell. Red lights meant nothing. Speed limits disappeared. The Cadillac tore through Harlem streets at 70 miles an hour, Frank's hands white-knuckled on the steering wheel. "God, please," Frank muttered, "don't take him like this." From the back seat, a voice came weak but sharp. "Frank." "I'm here, boss, almost home. Just hold on." "Stop the car." Frank hesitated. "We're 2 minutes away." "Stop the damn car." Frank pulled over. He turned around. Bumpy lay stretched across the leather seat, breathing shallow, skin the color of ash. But his eyes were clear, focused. He knew. "Listen to me," Bumpy said. "I don't have much time." Frank felt his throat close. "Don't talk like that. When I die, and I am dying, there's going to be a war for Harlem." Frank didn't speak. "The Italians will move first, then the Chinese. Every hustler with a crew will think they deserve my territory." Blood stained Bumpy's lips as he coughed. "You're the only one I trust," Bumpy continued. "The only one smart enough, loyal enough, hungry enough." Frank's heart pounded. "Boss." "You're going to have to do something bold," Bumpy interrupted. "Something nobody expects." Frank leaned closer. "Tell me what to do." Bumpy's breathing slowed. "In my bedroom, behind the picture of Marcus Garvey, there's a safe." Frank nodded. "Combination is 7-15-43, my birthday." Frank froze. "Bumpy." "Inside is $250,000, cash." Frank shook his head. "I can't take that." "Yes, you can, and you will." Bumpy's voice hardened, summoning the last of his strength. "That money isn't for hiding, it's for making a statement." The street was silent, except for the ticking engine. "Show Harlem you're not afraid," Bumpy whispered. "Show them you're not a coward." Frank swallowed. "How?" Bumpy's eyes fluttered. "You'll know when the moment comes." Then softer, almost tender. "Don't trust anybody. Not the Italians, not the cops, not your friends." His grip loosened. The only person you can trust is yourself. And just like that, the hand went limp. The breathing stopped. Frank Lucas sat there in the driver's seat, holding the hand of the man who had raised him into this world, staring at a truth too heavy to understand. Bumpy Johnson was dead. Harlem's king had fallen in the back of Frank Lucas's car. Frank didn't scream, didn't cry, didn't panic. He just sat there. Because kings don't die alone, they leave chaos behind. Frank drove the final blocks in silence, carried Bumpy's body into the brownstone, and laid him gently on his bed. When he called Bumpy's wife, his voice didn't shake. "He's gone," Frank said. "Heart attack, I brought him home." After the call ended, Frank stood alone in the bedroom. The room felt different now, emptier, heavier. He walked to the wall. The picture of Marcus Garvey came down easily. Behind it was the safe. Frank dialed the numbers. 7-15-43. Click. The door swung open. Stacks of cash, bundled hundreds, exactly $250,000. And an envelope. His name written in Bumpy Johnson's handwriting. Frank opened it. And as he read the first line, his hands began to shake, not from fear, but from the weight of destiny pressing down on him. "Frank, if you're reading this, I'm dead." And with that letter, the driver's life ended. And something far more dangerous was about to be born. Frank Lucas read the letter once. Then again. Then a third time. Each word felt heavier than the last, like Bumpy Johnson wasn't dead at all, like he was standing behind Frank, watching, judging, waiting. The room was silent except for the faint hum of Harlem outside the brownstone. Somewhere a car passed, somewhere music played, the city didn't know yet. But it would. Frank folded the letter carefully and slipped it into his jacket. He stood there with $250,000 in cash at his feet and a dead king on the bed behind him. And a question burning in his chest. Run or rule? Most men would have run. Frank knew that. Take the money. Disappear. Change names. Start over somewhere quiet and safe where nobody knew who Frank Lucas was. But Frank wasn't most men. For 15 years, he had watched Bumpy Johnson navigate power like a chessboard. He'd listened, learned, absorbed every lesson without ever speaking out of turn. He'd seen what fear did to men, what loyalty could build, and what hesitation destroyed. Bumpy hadn't chosen Frank by accident. Frank turned when he heard footsteps. Bumpy's wife, Mame, stood in the doorway. Her eyes were red, swollen, hollowed by grief. She took one look at the open safe and the stacks of cash inside, not shocked, not surprised. "So," she said quietly, "he finally told you." Frank didn't answer. She walked into the room slowly, touched Bumpy's face one last time, then looked back at Frank. "He never trusted easy," she said. "If he trusted you with this, then he knew." "Knew what?" Frank asked. "That tonight would decide Harlem's future." Frank met her gaze. "Every gangster in New York is going to come for this." Mame nodded. "That's why you can't disappear." Frank felt it settle inside him then, solid, unmovable. "I'm staying," he said. Mame studied him for a long moment, then she smiled faintly. "Then you're going to need to be louder than fear." News of Bumpy Johnson's death traveled fast. By morning, Harlem buzzed with whispers. By afternoon, it was confirmed. By nightfall, everyone who mattered knew the throne was empty. And empty thrones attract wolves. The Italians met quietly. The Chinese tongs sent feelers. Independent hustlers sharpened their knives. Nicky Barnes smiled behind closed doors. They all asked the same question. Who's next? Frank Lucas made sure they got an answer. He planned the funeral like a general plans a battle. Every preacher, every politician, every community leader, invitations sent. Phone calls made, dates leaked intentionally. Frank wanted the underworld to hear. He wanted witnesses. 3 days later, Harlem gathered. 2,000 people packed into the church. The air was thick with perfume, sweat, tension, black suits, white collars, cold eyes calculating profit instead of mourning. Frank stood in the back, watching. Italian mobsters whispered to each other. Chinese bosses sat stiff and silent. Nicky Barnes leaned back confidently, already imagining himself wearing the crown. They still saw Frank as what he used to be. The driver. Frank waited. Then he walked down the center aisle carrying a black briefcase. Heads turned. Whispers followed. What's he doing? Why is Bumpy's driver walking like that? Frank reached the casket. He set the briefcase down and opened it. The sound echoed through the church. Cash. Stacks of it. Frank reached in and pulled out the first bundle, $10,000, and placed it gently on Bumpy Johnson's chest. Gasps rippled through the room. Another stack. Then another. And another. 10 stacks. $100,000. Placed openly, boldly, directly on the body of Harlem's fallen king. Silence swallowed the room. Frank turned. My name is Frank Lucas, he said calmly. For 15 years, I served Bumpy Johnson. He scanned the crowd. He taught me something important. Respect isn't taken, it's paid for. Frank pointed at the casket. This man didn't die rich, he died respected. Murmurs broke out. Frank's voice hardened. And I know what you're all thinking, that Harlem is for sale. He pointed slowly, directly at the Italians. You think you'll collect tribute. Then at Nicky Barnes. You think youth and ambition make you king. Frank shook his head. You're wrong. The room tensed. Bumpy didn't build this for outsiders. He built it for Harlem, and he left it to someone he trusted. Nicky Barnes stood up. You ain't nobody, he snapped. Frank didn't blink. I was nobody, he said, until I proved I'm willing to sacrifice everything. He gestured toward the cash. That's my life savings, and I buried it with my mentor. The message landed. Loud. Clear. You want Harlem, Frank continued. You come through me. The church erupted in chaos, shouting threats, disbelief. But Frank had already won something far more valuable than fear. Attention. As Frank walked out of the church, his hands shook, not from doubt but from adrenaline. He had declared war. And war answered quickly. That night the phone rang. An Italian voice. Ralph's restaurant, tomorrow night, come alone. Frank hung up and stared at the wall. Walking into Mafia territory alone was suicide. But fear was worse. The restaurant was empty except for one table. Carmen, acting boss of one of the 5 families, sat surrounded by muscle. Frank sat down anyway. You got courage, Carmen said, or you got death wishes. Frank smiled faintly. Depends who's asking. Carmen poured wine. Bumpy paid us, Carmen said. You don't want to. I don't answer to you. Carmen leaned in. That's going to get you killed. Frank leaned closer. Or rich. The room went still. Carmen laughed. I'll give you 3 months, he said. Prove you can hold Harlem without us. Frank extended his hand. They shook. Frank had 90 days. 90 days to become a king or a corpse. As he walked out alive, Frank knew the easy part was over. Now came the impossible. Because to truly rule Harlem, he'd have to do something no black man had ever done before. Fire end of part 2. Cliffhanger cutting out the Mafia, building something dangerous. Frank Lucas didn't sleep that night. The deal with the Mafia replayed in his head over and over. 90 days. That wasn't mercy. That was a countdown, a ticking clock tied to his life. The Italians weren't rooting for him to succeed. They were waiting for him to fail. And failure meant death. By sunrise, Frank had already made the first decision that separated him from every other man who had tried to sit on Harlem's throne. He wasn't going to inherit Bumpy Johnson's empire. He was going to replace it. That morning, Frank called a meeting. Every dealer who had worked under Bumpy, every enforcer, every runner who knew the streets, 30 men in total. They gathered inside an old warehouse on 125th Street, the kind of place that smelled like oil, dust, and old secrets. The tension was thick. Some men leaned against walls with arms crossed. Others whispered. A few watched Frank like hunters watching prey. They didn't see a king. They saw a gamble. Frank stood in front of them, hands behind his back. "Bumpy is dead," he said simply. No gasps, no surprise. Everyone already knew. "Some of you are thinking about leaving," Frank continued. "Working for someone else, starting your own thing." He paused. "I don't blame you." That caught their attention. "But here's what you need to know," Frank said. "Everything you think made Bumpy powerful, I learned it." Murmurs moved through the room. I watched how he negotiated, how he controlled territory without blood, how he avoided cops, how he kept loyalty stronger than fear. Frank stepped forward, and I learned one more thing. The room went quiet. How to be patient. A man named Jerome stood up, big, loud, respected. "You ain't never run nothing," Jerome said. "You drove Bumpy around, that's it." Frank nodded. "You're right." Some men smirked. "I haven't run anything yet," Frank said. "But I just sat across the table from the Italian Mafia, and I walked out alive." The room shifted. I put $100,000 in Bumpy's casket to show Harlem I'm not playing. Silence. I'm standing here instead of running. Frank looked around. "That's why you should listen to what I say next." Jerome slowly sat down. "From today on," Frank said, "we do something Bumpy never did." The men leaned in. "We cut out the Italians." The room exploded. "That's suicide. They'll kill us." "You don't do that." Frank raised his hand. Everyone calmed down. The voices died down, but fear lingered. "We've been paying tribute our whole lives," Frank continued. 20–30% gone before we even touch it." Frank shook his head. "No more." One man raised a hand. "Were we getting the product?" Frank smiled for the first time. "Leave that to me." 2 weeks later, Frank Lucas was on a plane. Not to Miami. Not to L.A. Not to anywhere familiar. Southeast Asia. The Golden Triangle. A place most American gangsters had only heard whispered about. A place where raw power, not reputation, decided who walked away alive. Frank traveled light, no flashy clothes, no entourage, no arrogance. Just confidence. He met men who didn't care about Harlem, didn't care about race, didn't care about legends. They cared about numbers. Frank offered them something nobody else had. No middlemen. No Italians. Direct business. They laughed at first. Then they listened. Then they agreed. Frank Lucas had just done the unthinkable. He had bypassed the entire American crime hierarchy. When the first shipment arrived in Harlem, nobody believed it. The product was cleaner, stronger, cheaper. Frank named it Blue Magic. The streets noticed immediately. Dealers switched sides quietly, addicts followed quality, money flowed fast. Within 30 days, Frank controlled 40% of Harlem. By 60 days, 60%. The Italians noticed. Phone calls came, threats followed. Frank ignored them. He stayed invisible. No parties, no headlines, no attention. He drove the same cars, wore the same clothes. Power without noise. By day 90, Carmen called. "How the hell are you doing this?" Frank's voice was calm. "I told you I'm smarter than you think." Silence on the line. "Deal's a deal," Carmen finally said. "Harlem's yours." Frank hung up. He had won. Or so he thought. Because power has a way of changing men. And Frank Lucas was about to forget the most important lesson Bumpy ever taught him. Stay invisible. For the first time in his life, Frank Lucas had everything. Money came in so fast it stopped feeling real. Buildings, cars, properties in different states. Cash stacked in rooms like furniture. Harlem moved to his rhythm now, quietly, efficiently, without chaos. And that was the secret. Frank Lucas ruled silently. While other men chased attention, Frank stayed invisible. No flashy interviews, no newspaper photos, no loud nights in nightclubs. He dressed plain, drove modest cars, blended into crowds like he didn't exist. That's how Bumpy survived. That's how Frank survived. For 5 years, from 1968 to 1973, Frank Lucas became the most powerful man in Harlem without the city ever fully realizing it. And that scared people. Nicky Barnes noticed first. Barnes loved attention. Furs, cameras, headlines. He wanted Harlem to see him, to fear him, to envy him. And nothing irritated him more than knowing Frank Lucas controlled more territory without anyone knowing his name. "He think he's smarter than everybody," Barnes told his crew. "Let him hide, nobody stays invisible forever." Barnes was right. Nobody does. Frank lived by a strict rule: never bring business home. His wife Eva knew he had money, but not how much. She knew he traveled, but not where. Frank kept her away from meetings, away from numbers, away from the truth. He thought that was protection. But protection turns into distance. Eva liked nice things. She came from nothing too. She had tasted poverty and never wanted to go back. And slowly, she began to push. "Why we living like this?" she asked one night. "You got money, everybody knows it." Frank didn't look up. "Nobody knows nothing." "That's a lie," she snapped. "Everybody knows." Frank sighed. "Knowing and proving are two different things." Eva didn't understand that. And Frank didn't explain. That was his mistake. By 1971, Frank Lucas was making more money than he could count. $1 million a day at his peak. But money does something dangerous to men who come from nothing. It whispers, "You deserve this. You earned this. Let them see." Frank resisted for years. Until one night he didn't. March 8, 1971. Madison Square Garden. The fight of the century. Muhammad Ali versus Joe Frazier. Every celebrity in America was there. Politicians, actors, mob bosses, cameras everywhere. Frank had ringside seats. Not just seats. The best seats in the house. Eva stood in front of the mirror that night, smiling. "What do you think?" she asked. Frank turned and froze. She was wearing elegance. He was wearing temptation. A floor-length chinchilla coat. Worth $50,000. The kind of coat that didn't whisper wealth. It screamed it. Frank hesitated. For just a moment. Bumpy's voice echoed faintly in his mind. "The loud man dies." Frank pushed the thought away. "It's just a fight," he said. But deep down he knew. This wasn't just a coat. It was a signal. Across the arena, a man watched Frank Lucas walk to his seat. Detective Richie Roberts. Roberts had been hearing rumors for years. A ghost dealer, unlimited supply, no arrests, no trail. Frank Lucas. Nobody could ever prove it. Until that coat. Richie leaned toward his partner. "Who's that?" "Some guy from Harlem." Richie shook his head. "Nobody wears a $50,000 coat to a boxing match unless they're dirty." That was the moment. The exact second Frank Lucas stopped being invisible. The investigation began quietly. No raids, no arrests, just observation. Richie followed patterns, watched movements, tracked associates, learned habits. Frank felt it but ignored it. He was still winning. Still powerful. Still untouchable. Or so he thought. By 1975, the walls closed in. The DEA raided Frank's house in New Jersey. Cash heroin ledgers. Evidence everywhere. Frank Lucas was arrested. Life in prison. As he sat alone in a cold cell, the truth finally hit him. Not the arrest. Not the prison. The coat. He thought about Bumpy's letter. The moment you want people to see you're rich, you're finished. Frank had broken the one rule that mattered. But Frank Lucas wasn't finished yet. Because Frank Lucas knew something nobody else did. Everything. The cops, the mafia, the connections. He called Richie Roberts. "I'll talk," Frank said, "all of it." Richie listened. And history shifted again. Frank Lucas became the most dangerous kind of man. A man with nothing left to lose. The jail cell was colder than Frank Lucas expected. Not just the concrete walls or the steel bars, but the silence. No phones ringing, no footsteps waiting for orders, no envelopes of cash changing hands, just time, endless, unforgiving time. For the first time in years, Frank Lucas had nothing to manage. Nothing except his memories. He sat on the bunk and stared at his hands. The same hands that once counted millions. The same hands that carried Bumpy Johnson's body. The same hands that signed off on an empire. Now they were empty. The guard opened the slot in the door. "You got a call." Frank already knew who it was. Richie Roberts. Frank picked up the phone, his voice steady. "I'll tell you everything," Frank said. "Names, roots, money, cops, mafia." Richie paused. "Why?" Frank closed his eyes. "Because I'm not going down alone." What Frank offered was unheard of. He didn't trickle information, he flooded the system. Every corrupt NYPD detective who had taken money, every middleman in the French connection, every Italian boss who thought he was untouchable, locations, dates, amounts. Richie realized something terrifying. Frank Lucas wasn't bargaining. He was detonating a bomb. The arrests came fast, then faster, then nonstop. Police officers in handcuffs, detectives dragged out of precincts, mafia soldiers flipping on bosses, entire networks collapsing overnight. New York law enforcement was exposed as rotten to the core. The newspapers called it a scandal. The streets called it betrayal. The underworld called it war. Frank Lucas became a marked man. Inside prison, guards whispered his name like it was cursed. Inmates looked at him with a mix of fear and hatred. Snitches didn't live long. And Frank knew it. But something strange happened. He survived. Because Frank didn't betray for money. He betrayed for control. He cooperated fully, calmly, completely. And in return, the system did something it rarely did. It listened. The sentence came down hard. 70 years. Frank stood motionless as the judge read it. Then Richie leaned in. "Help us finish it," Richie whispered, "and we'll fight for you." Frank nodded. He had already crossed every line. Why stop now? 7 years later, the gates opened. Frank Lucas walked out of prison with 2 bags and nothing else. No money. No empire. No protection. Everything had been seized. Homes, cars, cash gone. Eva didn't come back. The kids barely spoke to him. Harlem had moved on. The streets didn't need him anymore. For the first time since July 7, 1968. Frank Lucas was nobody again. Years passed. Frank tried to live clean, worked with kids, spoke at schools, warned them about chasing power too fast. Sometimes they listened. Sometimes they laughed. At night, Frank would sit alone and think. About Bumpy. About the letter. About the coat. People asked him the same question over and over. Was it worth it? Frank always answered carefully. Depends when you ask me. He'd smile faintly. Ask me when I was ringside at Ali versus Frazier, wearing that coat, making $1 million a day. Then his smile would fade. But ask me when I was locked in a cell, when my wife left, when my kids wouldn't answer my calls. Silence. No, he'd say, it wasn't worth it then. Frank Lucas died quietly in 2019. No headlines. No crowds. No crown. Just a man who once ruled Harlem and paid the full price. But the story didn't end there. Because Frank Lucas left behind something more powerful than money. A lesson. And in part 6, the final chapter, we'll answer the real question. Was Frank Lucas a villain? A victim? Or a man who dared to take what the world told him he could never have? The world didn't stop when Frank Lucas died. No sirens. No headlines screaming his name. No crowds lining the streets of Harlem. Just another quiet morning. And that more than prison, more than betrayal, more than the loss of his empire. That silence was the real ending. Because men like Frank Lucas don't fear death. They fear being forgotten. Long before the coffin was lowered into the ground, Frank Lucas had already been buried by history. To some, he was a monster. To others, a legend. To many in Harlem, he was a complicated memory they didn't know how to explain. Frank Lucas didn't rob banks. He didn't kidnap children. He didn't run from the streets. He built something, and that's what made him dangerous. Frank used to say something that confused people. I wasn't a gangster, I was a businessman. But business has rules. And Frank broke all of them. He didn't just sell drugs, he revolutionized the trade. Cut out the Mafia. Controlled the supply. Lowered prices. Improved quality. To the addicts, it was poison. To the streets, it was power. To Frank, it was efficiency. He learned that from Bumpy Johnson. Bumpy never taught Frank how to kill. He taught him how to think. Own the product, Bumpy once said. Own the people, then nobody owns you. Frank listened, and he listened well. But here's the truth most stories leave out. Frank Lucas didn't beat the system. The system beat him. It just took longer. When Frank ruled Harlem, he believed he was invisible. Protected by money. Protected by corrupt cops. Protected by fear. But power attracts attention. And attention attracts consequences. Every empire, legal or illegal, collapses the same way. From the inside. When Frank cooperated with Richie Roberts, people called him a rat. But Frank didn't see it that way. In his mind, loyalty was a contract. And contracts expire when one side cheats. The cops took his money. The Mafia tried to kill him. The streets waited for him to fall. Frank didn't betray a code. He exposed a lie. That the system had rules. It didn't. It never did. After prison, Frank tried to rewrite his story. He wore cheap clothes, took buses, spoke softly, but legends don't disappear that easily. People still stared, still whispered, still asked questions. Is it true? Did you really bring it in coffins? Were you really richer than the Mafia? Frank would nod, not with pride, with exhaustion, because telling the truth didn't change anything anymore. One night years later, Frank sat alone in a small apartment. No guards, no guns, no empire, just a television playing old footage. Muhammad Ali, Joe Frazier, Madison Square Garden. Frank watched himself in the crowd. That coat, that smile, that moment, the night the world finally noticed him. Frank turned the TV off. He didn't need reminders. That single moment of pride had cost him everything. People like simple endings. They want heroes or villains. Frank Lucas was neither. He wasn't born evil. He wasn't born special. He was born poor. Born angry. Born watching other men control his fate. So he decided to take control himself. And he did. But power doesn't ask if you're ready. It only asks how much you're willing to lose. Harlem still debates Frank Lucas. Some say he destroyed the community. Others say the community was already broken, and he just played the game better than anyone else. The truth sits somewhere in between. Frank Lucas didn't invent drugs. He didn't invent corruption. He didn't invent greed. He simply exposed how far America would go, as long as the money kept moving. Near the end of his life, a young man once asked Frank a question. If you could do it all again, would you? Frank didn't answer right away. He looked down at his hands. Old hands now. Slow hands. Hands that once ruled Harlem. No, he said finally. Because winning the game means nothing. If the game takes everything from you. Frank Lucas died without power. Without fear. Without followers. But not without meaning. Because his life proved one brutal truth. You can rise from nothing, beat every gatekeeper, outsmart every enemy, and still lose. So what was Frank Lucas? A criminal? Yes. A mastermind? Absolutely. A product of his environment. Without question. But more than anything, Frank Lucas was a warning. A reminder that power without restraint destroys the hand that holds it. That loyalty built on money always expires. And that the crown everyone chases is heavier than it looks. The night Bumpy Johnson died, Frank Lucas became king. The day he stepped out of prison, he became human again. And maybe that was the real punishment.